Hey y'all, how's it going? My name's Alex, this is History with Character, and you do not need to adjust your TV set. I'm actually uploading a couple of times in just a couple of weeks. Today we're going to be working on my Regency stays. These are from the red threaded pattern, and you may have seen very recently that I made the mock-up of this pattern, and it came out pretty well straight out of the package. I was very impressed by this, and I was very excited to get started on my Regency stays for my upcoming project, which I will be officially announcing in the next video. Just know that the playlist that this video has been added to is not an error. It's actually the title of this project. So see if you can guess what that character might be between now and then. There were a few mistakes made in the process of building this pair of stays, but overall I'm pretty happy with them, and I hope you will be too. Thank you for joining me, and let's get started. As usual, we start off with me floor trolling it up. Normally, I would be taking these pieces and pinning them in and cutting them out of the pattern. In this case, however, I've already cut out the strength layer out of a cotton canvas, and I am tracing these onto my fashion layer, which is a poly satin. This is done to give me kind of an outline or a blueprint of where I want these pieces to lay on the fabric. It also lets me see where my edges are so I can cut big around them, as you see me doing here. This is because these pieces have to be flat-lined together. When you're flatlining, it can be very difficult to make sure that the two pieces line up exactly right. So, by cutting them large, flatlining them together, and then trimming it down, I'm going to save myself a lot of time and effort later on. The pieces are then laid out together, and I pin the strength layer onto the fashion layer from the strength layer side. You can see that I've marked out where all of my gores and my bones are going to be. This is done in a 9B graphite pencil because the other methods that I had available to me either wouldn't show up or would have very easily been ironed away in the process of making these stays. Once I had all of the pieces lined up, I really quickly ran them through my machine on a small zigzag stitch just along the very, very edges of each piece. Once I had flatlined these pieces together, I could basically treat them as if they were one piece of fabric for the rest of the project. I did this on the gores, and I did this on all of the major pieces as well. This project has 8 different gores and 3 major pieces, front, side, and back. Because this is a back closing set of stays, I'm not used to that because I don't have to make it in halves like I do for a standard corset. Once all the flatlining was completed, I trimmed down all of the edges to make them look nice and neat and pretty. This is about the nicest they're going to look for the rest of the video, so brace yourself for that. Once I had all of them trimmed up, I quickly stay stitched the gores along the stitching line as directed in the pattern. This makes installation a lot easier later on. Then I did some quick stay stitching around the edges of the gores. This is to give me a turning line and to prevent fraying once the gores get clipped. At some point in this process, I managed to singe my fabric a little bit with my iron. Do as I say, not as I do, kids. Check your iron heat before you start using it. Then it was just a matter of clipping the gores all the way down to that stitch line. This is on the front piece where the bust gores are supposed to be installed. I quickly folded those over and gave them a press and did my best to not burn myself, though that was rather difficult when you have such a tiny seam allowance and such a small area that you have to press down with your fingers. I saw a trick on TikTok for how to do this, and I only saw it after I finished this process, but next time I have to do this kind of thing, I will 100% be attempting it. Give everything a quick steam to make sure it stays where it's supposed to stay. And as per always, I am busy listening to Critical Role as this entire project is going on. I love that show so much. Once the gore seam areas were all folded over, I then took the gores that I had previously stitched along those stitch lines, lined up that folded edge with the stitch line, and pinned it together. This is how the gores get installed while allowing for a nice, neat, finished edge on all of the pieces. Then the gores are stitched as close to that folded edge as possible. This again allows for the nice finished edge to be there, but also to have those gores installed. Once the gores were installed, I went back and top stitched about 1/8 of an inch away from the original line of stitching by eye. This doesn't really seem to do anything construction-wise, but it sure does make everything look nice and neat and tidy. I need to implement top stitching in more of my projects, honestly. After installing all 4 bust gores, I did the exact same thing for the hip gores. However, I seem to have lost that footage. If anybody knows where that ended up, please let me know. Just assume it's the exact same thing as the bust gores, just in a different location. I also stitched a little bit inside of the stitching lines because I noticed on my mock-up that that was the one area where the stays were just a little bit too big for me. Once the hip gores were installed, I was able to install all of the boning along the interior of the stays. This is not the boning that sits on the seams, that will be added later. This is specifically the stuff in the middle of the panels. This was done with just some 1/2-inch twill tape that I stitched down as close to that edge as I possibly could. I got very good at stitching close to edges. Then I had to attack the center back. To make things easier on myself, I stitched along the back fold line. This area is reinforced to allow for the eyelets, and by stitching along this back fold line, it gave me a visual of where I needed to fold over the piece, as you can see me doing here. This area will not only hold the eyelets, but also 2 structural bones, so it's very important that this area be structurally sound as best as it can be. Once again, steamed it down. I iron from the backside most of the time, just in case my iron decides to spit water everywhere or decides to singe or do something like that. Then I stitch down that fold. This is going to be the outer edge of one of the bones holding this area in place. Then I stitched about a little over half an inch away from the edge to create that edge bone on the center back panel. Of course, I did this twice for both panels. I went back through and marked out in a heat erasable pen where the other side of the bone should go on the inside of the fold. Normally I would have done this from the back, but the back was a little bit of a mess, as you'll see soon. The front gores go onto the front piece at the very bottom, and they're sewn in a very unique way. It's difficult to see here, but the edges do not match up. The seam allowance on the front piece is 5/8 of an inch, and the seam allowance on the gore itself is 3/8 of an inch. So they do not match up, and that's done for a reason. That reason is to allow for a little bit of extra movement, I think. I'm not entirely sure. I just do what the instructions tell me to do. What I should have done is what I did in the original mock-up, which is where I stitched along the seam line of the front section to show me where the two seams needed to line up. Backstitch at the point, as always. And then just stitch it onto the side piece. The side piece is done by stitching the 3/8 and 5/8 of an inch seam allowances together, backstitching at the point, and then stitching the two side pieces together at 5/8 of an inch. This is hard to explain. It's one of those things that I kind of read the instructions and didn't understand, but then once I sat down and actually started doing it, it made a lot more sense. Of course, that's just how I am. I am always the type of person, you can show me something 3 or 4 times, and until I physically do the thing, I will not understand what you're asking me to do. Go back to that point and stitch all the way up the side at 5/8 of an inch of a seam allowance. The back was then installed, nothing fancy here, just the side to the back piece. And then all of those structural seams were re-stitched. This is to provide an additional layer of strength. The instructions say to do your first line of stitching at a longer stitch length so that you can adjust and move things, and then do the reinforcement at a shorter stitch length. Then all of the seam allowances were ironed flat. The ones that are actually on the seam lines holding the pieces together were ironed to one side. The ones around the gores were ironed flat. This was to give me a place to put the additional boning for the seam lines. Had to get out the tailor's ham here. I stitched about 1/8 of an inch away from all of the seams to give it more of a finished look, and also to reinforce the boning casing, as it were. even with no bones in it, you can see how stiff and structurally sound this piece is. This is where you can kind of see what I was talking about the interior being a little bit messy, but that's okay. I marked along the seam allowances with, again, a heat erasable pen and really quickly sewed down those edges. For the most part, the seam allowance serves as the bone casing, but in some cases it does get a little bit shallow. It's fine, it'll do. And here is where I made the biggest mistake of this entire project. I put the stays in the washer to get rid of all of the graphite and pen markings. I did not put them in the dryer, just the washer. While they were in the washer, I took out that busk pocket that has been sitting around for ages doing nothing, and really quickly did some eyelets. Now, this was my first time making hand-sewn eyelets, and you can see that I am struggling. With the fact that this pair of stays had so many eyelets on it though, I think at this point I'm getting pretty good at sewing them. I did learn that doing the stitches all in one motion it just doesn't work for me. So I would later resort to stab stitching instead. Like this. Then I got my mock-up with all of the bones and my now incredibly wrinkled pair of stays out. Apparently, I didn't wash the cotton canvas like I thought I had, and so it shrunk, but the satin did not, leaving all of these wrinkles and lumps, and it just doesn't look great. I transferred all of the old bones from the mock-up into the new pair of stays because I'm not wasting that kind of material, and then I stitched in the busk pocket. You may say, hey, that looks a little bit crooked, and it is, because it took me 3 or 4 attempts to get the busk pocket to sit correctly. It is correct on the final version. I only got footage of this one attempt, though. Then I went outside where my phone refused to focus on the actual project that I was working on, and instead focused on the grimy storage chest thing that I was working over. In this case, though, I'm just using my Dremel and a rotary bit to file down the edges of the synthetic whalebone that I bought from Burnley and Trowbridge. Do as I say, not as I do, kids. You should probably be wearing a respirator while you do this. Then I just had to sit down and do all of the hand finishing. Like I've said in a few videos before, I really do prefer to wait until I have nothing but hand finishing to start working on that part. That's because it's one of my least favorite parts to do, but also I can, instead of having to get up and go back and forth between my sewing machine and my desk, I can just sit at my desk. I also accidentally got nothing but my shoulder in this shot, so you just have to trust me on the fact that I am stitching on some 1/2-inch twill tape around the edges of the stays. Now, see if you can figure out where I messed up here before I do. It's okay, I went back and fixed it, it's fine. In this case though, the drawstring has to sit underneath the binding, of course. So the two pieces of binding are stitched together with about 1/4 inch of open space between them for the drawstrings to come through. So that's how we did it. I stopped about 3 inches away from where the center front was and stitched the two pieces of twill tape together, leaving about 1/4 inch gap in that seam for the drawstrings. You can do this by machine, but I was a little bit concerned and didn't want to accidentally break anything. the pattern itself does have some really good instructions on how to do it by machine if you're so inclined. And here's where I figured out what I did wrong. Get some clippy crab things, and realize that I stitched on a piece of scrap instead of the actual piece of binding. That's okay though, I fixed that really quickly and got my drawstring installed. You stitch that on, just a real quick trip to the machine, did a couple layers of forward and back stitches over the ends, and then stitch it through the eyelets on the busk pocket. Then I stitched the top binding down around the drawstring. I had to be very, very careful not to catch the drawstring in this. The drawstring was some like 1/4-inch ribbon I had laying around. Nothing too fancy, just some off-ray that I got from Joann's. It's not ideal, but it works. And every few stitches I would go in and pull the drawstring to make sure that I hadn't accidentally caught it in any of my earlier stitches. Then it was time for the eyelets. I marked them out using a heat erasable pen and got to stabbing. At this point I actually suddenly got laid off, and so the stabbing was rather good for my morale. I keep going back and forth with the awl just to make sure that the hole stays open for me. I want these eyelets to be as big as I can possibly get them, and looking back, I probably should have gotten a die and cut the eyelets, but this way works too. Again, this is my first time doing hand-sewn eyelets, so it took me a while, but I eventually came up with a method that I think looks really good and really sturdy. Essentially, I'm just stab stitching my way around. I did about 2 rows of the stitching just to make sure that it looked really nice and all of the interior edges were covered up. Do not do what I'm doing here, folks. Do not put your needles in your mouth. I attempted to do this part by machine, but it just did not work. It looked awful, and I was going to have to go back and fix so much of it by hand that I just ripped off the original binding and did the entire thing by hand anyway. It would have saved me time to just have started out like this, honestly, but just stitch down the binding. Going around that curve was kind of tough, but it worked out just fine. And finally, I was able to get back to my sewing machine and stitch down the straps on these stays. This was the final step, and I was so ready for this to be over at this point. I stitched in the ditch along the top binding to connect the stays to the back of the piece. In this case, I was able to push all of the bones down really far so that my needle wouldn't hit any of them, because the other option was to stitch them on by hand, and I'm lazy and I don't want to do that. And that's that. I am so pleased with how these came out, other than the obvious issue of the wrinkles. I If I had more fabric, I would go back and redo these, but I don't have the fabric and I don't have the time, to be honest. I'm on a bit of a con crunch right now, and I know I say that a lot, and that's because of the ADHD. But I think they're going to do very nicely for this project. I think they're going to look very nice and give me the shape that I need for the dress that I'm making. They're really an undergarment, so it's not that big of a deal if anybody sees them or not. As always, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time for a project announcement. I look forward to it. Stay safe, y'all.